So while we're getting going here, just wanted to talk about a few of the, just let you know, if we're gonna, there will be a chance for questions during this session. Why don't we, anytime you have a question, please put it in the chat box. I'll be looking for that, and we can ask those when we get to an appropriate point. And also, it looks like everybody's done this. Please go ahead and mute your mic for now, and we'll go on ahead. So I think we have everybody. Everybody who's signed up, has accepted the meeting, has signed up, has registered, logged in now. So that's great. And we will go ahead. I'm going to introduce our presenter today. It's Robert Scardamalia. He's the president of RLS Demographics. He's been doing that position since 2010. He's also currently on the adjunct faculty at SUNY Albany. And before RLS Demographics, he was the chief demographer and state data center director within the New York State Department of Economic Development. He was in that position for over 20 years. So I've worked with Bob now on 2 population projections projects, and it's always been very good working experiences each time. So I will just go ahead, hand it over to Bob Scardamalia.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you. It's good to see a large crew of folks interested in population projections. It's generally one of the more esoteric types of topics. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to switch over and kind of take control of the screen here and get started. If it'll let me get to my, let's see. You are not seeing this, are you? Let me share system audio window. Ken, are you seeing the PowerPoint? I'm not seeing that it's seeing my.
No, it doesn't seem to be coming up at this point.
Okay.
Do you want me to try it from my machine?
Let me just try one more time. I'm going
to
open the share tray. See, it doesn't show me all of my windows. I think maybe you better do that if that.
Okay, let me do that. Okay, are people seeing New Hampshire population projections PowerPoint slide at this point? Okay.
Yes, but it's not in not in slideshow view.
Finding it. There we go.
Okay, great. Glad we had the backup. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is first a little bit of PowerPoint, kind of to give a general sense of what this operation, what the project was about to do population projections, and the methodology by which I go through to develop all of the input data and understand the demographic components behind population change for New Hampshire. And, you know, I just feel obligated to remind everybody that nobody's got that crystal ball. And I can't tell you how many times in our regular meetings about doing the projections, we had to keep on realizing that, you know, we had a lot of speculation about what could happen, but we don't really know what's going to happen. But what we try and do is bring together the standard methods of evaluating demographic data and trends over the generally more recent past in coming up with assumptions about what the future would be. So if you go to the next one, Ken, the process starts with looking at some historical population changes. And so what this is showing you is simply population change by county for New Hampshire for the last decade. And these numbers are based on the decennial census data, 2010 to 2020. So they're really the most accurate set of population totals that we have for the state and counties. And you can see that most of New Hampshire's counties are growing and growing reasonably well, with most of them over 4% in the decade, and Rockingham and Stratford over 6%. Kuas, on the other hand, as a rural and aging population, has seen the largest loss, and Sullivan not anywhere near the extent of loss, but the other county that provides loss. So this gives me the initial picture of change, but it's got to get a lot more detailed than this before we do population projections. So if you go to the next. So the methodology that is used for doing projections, demographic projections, like age and sex projections, is a pretty standard one. It's called cohort component method. Cohort because it's looking at groups of individuals. And in this case, in this application for projection, those individuals are grouped by age, 5-year age categories. So we start with young children, 0 to 4 years old, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, on up to 85 and over. So we have a distribution of the entire population by age. That's the cohort piece, because we're going to be following those age cohorts through time. In the historical portion, we're going to be looking at their past change, and in the projections, we're going to be looking at future changes. Now, there are really only 3 ways that population changes for any geographic entity. People are born, people die, people migrate. Now, the extent or the importance of each of those is dependent upon the geographic entity we're talking about. If we were talking about the U.S. as a whole, it's not migration within the country, state to state, it's foreign immigration or immigration, people leaving or entering the country. So it depends on the geography. In order to look at, analyze, and project fertility, we have to know something about births, and births by age of mother, because women of different ages have different birth rates. And so as the population changes, simply stable birth rates will change the number of births if the number of women of childbearing age changes. So we have to keep track of both. Mortality, analogous. Number of deaths by age and gender. Particularly once we get to the older ages, gender takes hold and women live longer than males. So we have to be careful to take that into account. And migration, when we're talking about counties, migration data in the country, our country is not, we aren't tracking individuals. There's no real mechanism for doing that in the United States. And so we're estimating migration, and the methods for estimating generally do not get flows. In other words, individual information data on people who leave New Hampshire, people who enter New Hampshire. And so we generally work with it on a net basis, the balance between the those who come in and those who go out. But also, back to the cohort, that has to be by age and gender in order to feed the population projections model. Next. So this graphic kind of gives you a little overview to the 2 modules that I use to do projections. On the left-hand side, the components of change. So those components, births, deaths, and migration, each of them have to be evaluated separately in terms of historical patterns. And so in order to do that on a historical basis, there are a certain set of data inputs, and those result in outputs. And then those outputs feed into the second projection model. So in terms of the data inputs for the components, I need the decennial census population. And in this case, we're talking about 2010 to 2020. But that's a 10-year period, and 10-year period is a bit too long. So we also look at population estimates. The Census Bureau does those in cooperation with states on an annual basis. So we have some annual trends in between the decade midpoints. Populations like college students represent what we call group quarters, represent some anomalies. They don't behave the way the general population does. Colleges in particular. Colleges, four-year college, every year they've got incoming freshmen, outgoing seniors. That process disrupts rates for the general population. So we need detailed data on college students by sex and age. As I mentioned, births by age of mother. Deaths, before I get to deaths, so we've got births by age of mother for annual data. That comes from the state health department, but we also need the current total calendar year births by sex to break out male and female births. Believe it or not, there are slightly more male births than female births historically, and I don't know if it's genetically, but goes back to, I don't know, caveman fighting the saber-toothed tiger and needing to be more of them, I don't know. But there are slightly more, out of 100, there are about 51 males born for every 49 females. And we also need deaths by age of the decedent and by sex. So all of those are taken account when we do the components of change analysis. And after that, and I'm going to walk you through this, I'm going through this PowerPoint, but then we're going to go through a demo of both of these projections models. So I'll talk in more detail about that when we get there. But out of those inputs, what I get are age, sex-specific survival rates for the population so that we can forecast how many folks of what age are going to die in the future. Age-specific fertility patterns, which apply to women of childbearing years to generate births. Something called the total fertility rate. You may be familiar with the term that's used pretty frequently of 2.1 as what we call the replacement rate. That's the number, average number of children a woman must have to account for herself, a partner, and folks who cannot or do not have children. That controls the fertility level. Similar to the fertility, we need the age-specific patterns for migration and accrued migration rate, which determines the absolute level of migrants, either positive in migration or negative out migration. And the sex ratio at birth, which comes from directly from the vital statistics data. Those data feed into the projections model. And what the projections model does is start with the most recent decennial census, which in our case is 2020. It takes projected school enrollment, which is generally pretty difficult to find. Some schools project their enrollment. In New York, ages ago, the state education department used to project enrollment for all colleges. They no longer do that. So we've made the assumption that the college enrollment is going to stay stable through the projections period. But coming out of those component outputs, we've got the age-specific survival rates, age-specific fertility patterns, total fertility rate, age-specific migration rates, and accrued migration rate, and sex ratio of birth. So that's the direct link between the historical analysis and what feeds in as the starting point for the projections. And out of the projections model, we get total population details by age and sex, the percent distribution, total projected births and deaths, and migrants by age and sex. So there's an awful lot of data that comes out, and the projections process that we've gone through in the last few months is to run a variety of scenarios with those inputs and outputs. So the next one, Ken. So a little more detail about projecting births. We need these two measures, age pattern of fertility which is the individual age-specific fertility rates by age of mother. So what that does is take women 15 to 19, 20 to 24, all the way up to 45 to 49. So we have the base as the number of women. And the numerator is the number of births to women at those ages. And that comes directly from the state health department. And that gives us for each age a rate, a fertility rate, generally expressed per 1,000 women. So simply the number of births by age of mother divided by the female population gives us that rate. And that can, what controls the births by age of mother is the total fertility rate. So we've got the rate, but we can move that rate and generate more births. We can lower it and generate fewer births. And that's handled by the total fertility rate. And that's a combination of the fertility experience across all ages. And it controls the total number of births that we can regenerate. Next. This will give you a graphic example of what I just explained. So on the bottom here, you've got the table that presents the number of births, the female population, and the rate that is defined based on those data. Now, it says 3-year births. What we typically do is take 3 years of births and average them to smooth out any year-to-year variation. Because, you know, there just can be strange events or age composition of women that vary the number of births year to year. So the 3-year average is a little more stable. And the graphic on the top illustrates what those rates are. And what you can see here is simply the data that's in the table. For young women 15 to 19, fertility rates are very low. They've pretty much plummeted in the last couple of decades and remain very low. 20 to 24 used to be pretty high. It has dropped significantly in the last couple of decades. And now the 25 to 29 and 30 to 34 year age categories are where most births are occurring, women of those ages. So what this graphic shows is the shift in fertility patterns and represents a couple decades now of delayed childbearing, reduced number of births per woman, reduced family size and number of kids and families. And you know, most of those births now are occurring to women in their late 20s, early to mid 30s. And even some into the 40s, that number for 40 to 44 is still low, but has gone up a little bit. And we even have some births to women in their mid to late 40s. So this pattern, back just a little bit to, if I sum these age-specific total fertility rates, I'll come up with a total, age-specific fertility rates, right? I'll come up with the total fertility rate, that replacement level of 2.1. In most of New Hampshire counties, that rate is well below replacement. But with this pattern, so keep in mind this graphic pattern by age, I can specify a higher total fertility rate and lift that graphic up on the chart and generate more births, or I can keep that same pattern, specify a lower total fertility rate and generate fewer births. Okay, next one, Ken. Migration mortality is pretty straightforward and pretty detailed. You're probably familiar with hearing about reports on expectation of life at birth. Just recently, there was a report that birth life expectancy has declined by a couple of years in the country due solely to COVID. So it's a life table. That's the demographic construct that generates the life expectancy and is used to project survival. And what it does, it's detailed by, in many cases, a single year of age. What we're using are 5-year age categories, and it simulates the experience across all ages of mortality. Now, in the projection model, it's somewhat easier to project because changes are are more stable. Apart from something like COVID, which has had a dramatic impact, the change in survival is generally very slow. When there are improvements in infant mortality, it affects the youngest ages. Improvements in longevity, it affects the oldest ages. But for most of the age distribution, you'll see it in a moment in a graph. Complicated. I'll show it to you when we get into the demonstration of the components calculation process, but it's pretty detailed, something you don't need to worry, certainly not remember, but I want to go through so you recognize how we do this. It's called the life table survival rate method. The simple explanation is we know how many people were living in 2010 by age. We have survival distribution, so people who are 20 to 24, I have a probability of them surviving for 5 years to be 25 to 29. And I have an expected population from the population estimates. The difference between the expected and the survived population represents migrants. So that's a quick overview. I'll describe that in more detail when we get to the components method. So the next one, Ken. So here you see that graphic of age-specific migration rates. Doesn't look quite as nice and neat as the graphic for fertility. This shows you for the total population. We do these by male and female also. There tends to be a bit more variation by male and female. But a couple of things you notice here. In the very young ages, up till mid-teens, the two time periods and the average are very similar. Once we get to the mid-late 30s and throughout the rest of the age distribution, again, very similar between the two time periods. There's an awful lot of chaos going on in the earlier ages, between the 15 to 19s through the early 30s. And a good portion of that represents two different portions of the decade. If you think about it, early in 2010, we were still coming out of recession, 7, 8, and 9. And in fact, many areas had not come out of it in 2010 by the early part of the decade. Later in the decade, the economy had smoothed out and things were a little more back to normal. So right there you have one major event that is going to create a lot of discord in the migration rates. And that's what makes migration so difficult to handle. If we were going beyond 2020, we'd have another set of issues related to COVID that would impact this. And rather than seeing a lot of variation in those young ages, we'd probably be seeing it in the older ages because COVID had a much bigger impact. So migration becomes the tough one in doing projections. Okay, next one, Ken. Oh, we're done with that. Okay, so that lays out kind of the general process. And so what I'm going to go into first is the component side. So this is analysis of the historical data in order to generate these age patterns. So if you can switch over to the Excel.
Okay, Bob, I was just checking whether, what your permissions were. I didn't see anything the matter, but do you want to just try one more time with sharing from your side?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to stop then.
Okay, you're stopping, so I'm still getting just my desktop window, Ken. I don't understand. Every time we've done this, we've gotten all of my whole desktop.
Okay, yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that. I was checking the meeting, the meeting info and options, and it looked like everybody's attending is actually able to present. So I don't think there's anything at this end. I don't know if anybody listening has any ideas, but otherwise I can go ahead and share again.
Okay.
Okay. So let me just, all right, I'm going to go ahead. Okay, do you want me to get out of this components module introduction thing so I
Well,
can?
yeah, just click the X,
Yeah, okay,
and then it's going to come up with another little box window
got it.
and with documentation, and you can close that when it comes up.
Okay,
Yep,
very
close
good.
that. Okay. Now, oh, excellent. Okay, so this spreadsheet, as you see across the bottom, has a number of tabs to it. The first basic input is the population data, and you can see that at the top is the New Hampshire total, the 2010 census population by 5-year age category up to 85 and over. And if we were to scroll down, what you'd see is each of the 10 counties in New Hampshire repeated in exactly the same format. The 2015 population in the middle by age and sex comes from the Census Bureau's population estimates. And the 2020 census population in the last 3 columns sort of comes from the 2020 census. Now, let me give you an unfortunate situation around the release of 2020 census data. The Census Bureau met their legal requirements to provide state population totals for state and congressional redistricting. So the file that was released has the total population, very detailed population totals by racial group and Hispanic, Latino origin and various combinations of that. And it's required to have the voting age population, which is the 18 and over population. Typically, by this time in the decade, we would have the age-sex distributions of the population, at least at a county level, but the Census Bureau doesn't expect that to be released until the middle of next year. So the distribution, the age distribution that you see here is extrapolated, is probably the best word, from the 2010 census and 2015 estimates, extrapolated to 2020 and controlled to the census, 2020 census total population. So that term controlled simply means that we take the 2010 population, age it to be 2020, and then force that distribution to equal the 2020 census population. That forcing can be done for the 18 and over population, because we have that data, voting age population, from the census, but the individual age categories within that are reflecting the distribution that existed in 2010. So again, another caveat here is, in addition to the old mortality data, the second caveat is this does not represent the actual 2020 census age distribution. Come middle of 23, this could be revised with the actual distribution, but right now we don't have that. So there's some qualifiers here for sure, but we've got the best data we can. On the right-hand side, what you see is the special populations. And I noted that taking account of the college population was important, but that's not the only one. Nursing home residents are also group quarters populations because they don't migrate the way the general population does. So you're generally in the nursing home because of illness and inability to be mobile. And so where you might have the general population either continuing to retire to other locations or return migration, that does not occur with the nursing home population. So that's another special population category that's incorporated. There are also some significant prison populations in some of the counties, and the prisoner residency counts in the prisons are taken account. So what you see here are the actual data on nursing homes, colleges, and prisons that represent special populations. And you'll see how those come into play in another minute or two. So if you go to the next tab, Ken, mortality broken down by age and sex. And you'll notice, going back to that first caveat, what you're looking at is the 3-year average between 2009, 10, and 11, when we'd really like to have the 2019, 20, and 2021 data. And we take the average for the total, and we do that also for males and females. And that is the source of input data for our survival rates. And Ken, I'm going to ask you to jump over the tabs to the life table tab. Now, this is more numbers than any of you ever want to look at probably, but just to kind of relay what happens in this process, we've got the total population. I'm not talking about every column here. We're going to talk about the total population, which comes directly from the population input spreadsheet, the deaths that come directly from the mortality input, and you notice this is for the New Hampshire total, but then it's replicated for males and females, and for each of the 10 counties. The simple calculation is the next column, the age-specific death rate, which is simply the number of deaths divided by the population. And then the next column gets a little more into the statistical end of things, because this represents a probability of dying. So we have an age-specific death rate, which for many of the ages is for a 5-year period, but not everybody, this is a kind of morbid way of putting it, and I apologize, not everybody dies at the midpoint of the age interval, 22.5. They're spread across the 5-year periods. And so this next column, proportion dying in the interval, does that mathematically. It's more related to a probability of surviving from one 5-year age to the next. And the rest of the columns here are not really so important for the projections model, but the one column that all this intermediate calculation gives us is this lifetime remaining at each age. So this first value is what we typically hear in the media is life expectancy at birth. So being born in Hillsborough County, for the total population, combined males and females, expectation of life is 83 plus years. And then each age, as you get older, there's an expectation of remaining life until the bottom of the column, where it eventually goes to 0, obviously, because everybody has to die at some point. But the important piece is this last set of columns that are highlighted in blue, which represents the survival rate. And that comes from these intermediate columns. But this is the distribution that you saw in the graphic. And you can see how many of these ages are 0.99 something, all the way until we get into the 50-year categories. So that's why it stays so high for most of the age distribution before it starts to drop off, and drop off pretty significantly. Okay, so that's mortality. Let's go back to the fertility inputs. And here we've got the current vital statistics data. So you see we're using 2019, 2020, and 2021 by age of mother, and the 3-year average of births. And now this female NS population. This is the female non-special population. So from that first spreadsheet, the population inputs, this is simply the total population minus the special populations. So female non-special population, and that is then used as the denominator, divide the number of births, average number of births, by the number of women, and it gives us the age-specific fertility rates. And you can see that that's some, I think comes to what, 1.8 for New Hampshire as a total?
It's like 1.3, I would say.
1.3, okay. So New Hampshire overall has a very, very low rate of fertility. Remember, that replacement level was 2.1. So you're significantly below where the country as a whole is, and for many other states. That's the data that gives that age pattern that you saw in the graphic in the PowerPoint. The next set of columns here by year, male and female births, gives us that sex ratio at both, and you can see in most every year it hovers around 0.51. And there's so little variation by area and year that 0.51 is held consistent. So let's see, the next one is the, well, let's go to the fertility tab first, and then I'll come back to that one. So this basically gives you a graphic look at that same set of data, which now presents the differences. And so if we look at these first two, so New Hampshire total is the one that I showed you in the PowerPoint, the graphic here on the right. But then look at the difference between the New Hampshire total and Belknap County. So in New Hampshire overall, the peak ages of fertility of women were 30 to 34. In Belknap, not so. The peak fertility age range is the 25 to 29. And so if you want to just scroll through those slowly, you'll see the variation. Carroll, much more like New Hampshire as a whole. Cheshire kind of captures both. Peak, the highest fertility is in both of those age categories. Kulas, a very different tent-like pattern with higher rates in the 20 to 24 and 25 to 29, and then slowing. Grafton, highest in the 30 to 34. So you can see that each county represents a somewhat different pattern, similar to the state as a whole. And here in Rockingham, very clear peak in the 30 to 34 category. Stratford, notice how low Stratford is in the 15 to 19 and 20 to 24. Take out those college students, and the general population has a very, very low level of fertility. Sullivan County, very similar shape to Kuas. So you can see that there's pretty significant variation county to county, and that variation just simply has to be taken account of in the projections model. Ken, I should have done this when talking about the mortality, but if you can go back to that regional LT total. In constructing a life table, you need to have pretty detailed data. And what we've found is that in some of the smaller counties, the population size, is a terrible way of putting it, isn't large enough to generate enough deaths to construct a life table. Generally, you need a population of about 100,000. And when I say complete life table, what I mean is that it represents some probability of death at each age. In other words, the reported data doesn't have a lot of zeros. Good thing that the deaths don't occur, but in construction of a life table, we know that the probability of dying exists at every age. So if you scroll, we had to group counties together. So Hillsborough was large enough to have an independent life table, but we grouped together Belknap and Merrimack to get enough population. Same thing with Rockingham and Stratford. And then Carroll, Kuas, and Grafton were grouped together, and Cheshire and Sullivan. So that regional grouping was kind of done on the basis of our conversations in our meetings about what represented similar characteristics in the counties that would make sense to group them. So just kind of a step backwards, it's those regional breakdowns that went into the construction of the life table and the survival rates. So where we have multiple counties, there was one set of survival rates that was used for each of the counties. Okay, so now for the migration side of things. So net migration, another painful looking computational series. So what this does, you see that there's an age distribution on the left-hand side, and we take account of births occurring through the decade. And that second column, the special population, is what you saw in the population input data to subtract out, and that creates the household population. Again, college students, in terms of fertility, have very heavy impacts on the rates. Same thing with migration. So again, imagine college students. Every year you have an incoming group of freshmen and outgoing group of seniors. Those aren't really migrants. They are, but they're so consistent year to year that if you tried to calculate them as migrants, you'd really screw up the age distribution. At the same time, that college population generally stays fairly stable. And if we age that population in place at the college, instead of taking them out, then we'd have this bulge of enrolled students that would stay in that place and then age through the distribution. And they simply don't do that. New ones come in as freshmen, they exit again as seniors. They don't stay in place. So that's why we calculate this household population, particularly for the college students. Prisoners, same thing, generally concentrated in younger ages. Nursing homes in the older ages, we take account of all of those. And the survival rate, the next column that you see here, comes directly from that life table. And what we do is calculate the next column. How many people from 2010 survived to be 5 years older in 2015? So the 5 to 9 population, household population, 77,756 times the survival rate gives us population 5 years older, 67,803, if I'm reading that correctly. That's who we expect, given the base population. But that doesn't take account of migration. That's just aging the existing population. The actual here is the Census Bureau's population estimate, which you see in that age category is very different. It's about 5,000 higher. And so that's where we get the migration. The only way population changes, again, is births, deaths, and migration. So we've survived people who are already existing. The only other thing that can impact that population is migration. So what we're looking at is 4,711 migrants in the 20 to 2015 period. And we calculate the rate based upon the beginning population. So that column is what you saw in the graphic of the 2010 to 15 migration pattern. And then we do the operation again. So we have the actual number of folks in 2015. We apply the survival rate to age them another 5 years to be 2020. That gives us a new expected population compared to the 2020 household population. And that gives us a number of migrants. The difference between those two is a number of migrants and a new set of migration rates. So these two rate columns under the net migration represent the data that went into that graphic that you saw in the previous set of data in the PowerPoint. If you move further to the right there, Ken, you'll see the average migration rate and that graphic that we looked at earlier. So there's a lot of computation that goes in there. There's a couple places where there's certainly caveats and reasons why we often use the average migrations instead of the individual period migration. But this I wanted to illustrate where the data comes from, how we come up with that set of patterns that are used in the projection period. And let's see, there's a migration summary tab, which is the next one. And this simply says, okay, we've got the age pattern detail. What's the total rate of migration? And this data represents the crude migration rate, the total. And so again, like we've talked about with those age patterns for fertility and migration, the age pattern gives us this graphic look, and like the total fertility rate, the crude migration rate allows us to generate more positive migration or generate more negative migration by altering these rates. And this is a point in the projection model that becomes pretty critical and is where a lot of scenario testing gets done. I don't know, kind of, if anybody has any questions or if I've just kind of confused the entire world here. But I'll pause in case anyone has any question.
Bob, would you mind explaining there's two 2010, 2015. Oh, never mind. I'm ahead of myself. Or you're ahead of me, I should say.
No, I have one question.
Okay.
Going back to, I think either the life table or let's see, a mortality table. Oh, this here, for example. So are you keeping the survival rate constant for all the way out to 2050? Or I suppose this is changeable too.
It's all changeable.
Okay.
And in fact, there are some differences in here because what I mentioned pretty quickly very early on, the Social Security Administration does projections of survival. And so on a national basis, just for the nation, but on a national basis, we can look at what they project in terms of increased survival among the elderly in particular and among the younger population. And those percent changes in the Social Security Administration projections have been applied here. It generally doesn't make a lot of difference, but it just kind of, it reflects what is a probable reality that there's going to be some continued improvement, particularly after we get over the COVID impacts, that there will continue to then be new medical advances and improvements. So yes, that is incorporated. Another caveat though, there were times when incorporating that increase put the survival rate over 1, which is just not reality. There's always some risk of death. And so there have been just some manual adjustments to smooth out those characteristics.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bob?
I guess your comment raises a general statement that I should make. All of this can be varied in the assumptions. If I really believe that fertility rates are going to revert back to younger ages, well, I can make that assumption and change the future fertility patterns if I want to test the impact of that. And when we look at the projections, you can see how that scenario testing will work, and I'll run through some examples.
Bob?
Bob?
Yeah, we have a question from David Jeffers.
Yes, a question on the net migration tab on 20. I was looking at I happened to focus on the 85-year-old, 80-year-olds in 2015, I think. If you move to the left, there seemed to be a remarkably high migration, a doubling of the population from the expected. Any ideas what the cause might from 12,000 to 24,000?
Yeah, it's not quite so bad. Move a little bit further to the left, Ken. So if you look at the age labels here, the 12,000 is the 80 to 84s, and the 9,500 is the 80 to 85s. By the time we get to 2015, you've got the 23,000 plus as 85 and over. So what you really need to do to compare the two is add those two expected categories together.
Okay.
So it should, in reality, the comparison is between about what, 22,000, which would be the expected 85. Okay.
Thank you very much.
And so that's why the migration number is a much lower, because it's comparison with the sum of those two age categories.
Got it. Thank you.
Good question. Okay, anybody else? All righty, I guess we'll move on to the projections model then, Ken. You're going to get that same sequence of an image for New Hampshire, and then that box with documentation that you can close.
Okay, does that look like the right one?
Yes, it is.
Okay, let me enlarge it.
You must have already closed off the other ones.
I did.
Oh, okay.
Do you need to back open?
No.
Okay.
Okay, so for taking all of those outputs from the components analysis, they get fed in here in the projection model. And so we're starting with a base of the 2020 census population. And now you're going to see something a little bit different. You'll see this term DA, that stands for Demographic Analysis Estimates. Now the Census Bureau, well, as far as my work, really screwed me up, because they screwed me up but made it better. They did not, from the 2020 census, they did not release the age distribution, sex distribution, as I mentioned. And so I did that extrapolation to come up with an age distribution. But they also, in terms of their own analytical work, they do comparisons like that migration series that I just went through, of looking at what the expected 2020 population was, given the historical patterns, compared to what they actually enumerate in the census. Now, they haven't gotten to that stage yet because they don't have the actual 2020 age sex distribution, but they released, just in time for us to incorporate in the projection model, this distribution, which is called demographic analysis. And what they basically did is take the 2010 age distribution, do a lot of the same type of manipulation that I've just walked you through to age that population to 2020. This represents holding a lot consistent with the age distribution in 2010, but incorporating deaths and births to better replicate, or I shouldn't say replicate, better estimate what the expected 2020 population would be. So we agreed, I felt it was important, and we agreed that it was better to work off of this base in the projection model rather than the extrapolated set of age sex distributions that were initially calculated. So that's why this is different. And it's labeled as the DA demographic analysis to make sure that we're aware. It is not, since it hasn't been released, it is not the actual age sex distribution from the 2020 census. It's these demographic analysis estimates. But the next tab gives you the special populations and by county, and these basically reflect the same set of data that you saw in the components method. But here, if you were to scroll through in Belknap, all we're looking at are nursing home populations. Same thing in Carroll, only nursing home. Now Cheshire, you've got a college, so there's some pretty big numbers there in college, some prison populations and nursing homes. In Kuas, no colleges, but prison population and nursing homes. So you can see as you scroll through this, the special population, Grafton, Hillsborough, large college populations. So you can see how that detail affects counties depending upon what types of facilities are affecting. Stratford, very big in the college population, and in Sullivan, only in nursing home populations. So same process in the projection model. One of the first steps is remove the special populations from the base before we apply all of the fertility and mortality and migration rates. Okay, so the next tab is the survival rates. Pretty much the same thing you've looked at, and each iteration of the model. So the projection model works by taking the 2020 population, projecting to 2025. Then the 2025 becomes the base, and we project to 2030, and then so on. So it goes through a number of iterations, moving the population between each 5-year period. And so that's why, you know, these have been, they're specified in terms of individual projection periods, but these represent the same rates that you saw coming out of the life table model for separately for males and females. And the next tab is the migration patterns. Again, same, we'll go through the inputs here pretty quickly. The same construct that we saw in the net migration table in the components, same identical thing. And in this case, we've agreed that we don't know enough about the future to make changes in the age patterns. And so they are held constant throughout the entire projection interval. Now, a point to mention though, hypothetically, if in a particular county there was known changes that was going to impact, I'll speculate. We'll take a small county, but they know that they want to be a future community for the elderly population, and they're going to build a massive senior citizens community. Would that be justification for going in and changing the age pattern of migration? May well be. You know, that community isn't just nursing home specials. It could be, you know, independent living, senior apartments, the whole 9 yards, like we see in facilities today. And if I knew that was happening, maybe under construction, and I knew it was going to happen by 2030, it would be reasonable to go in and make some adjustments to the age patterns of migration. And that could be done, but we haven't. We haven't made any of those assumptions about future change in migration patterns. So the next tab is the crude migration rate. Now, there's one step in here that I'm not illustrating because we just simply are past it, and it results in these outputs. Given the initial components analysis that was done and the fertility, mortality, and migration rates that came out of that, one of the first steps in my projection process is to ask myself, well, I've calculated all of these rates based on the 2010 to 2020 time period. What happens if I start a projection run beginning with the 2010 population and inputting those rates and running it to 2020? And so I did that. And what I found was, particularly in migration and somewhat in fertility, what I was trying to replicate were the actual reported vital statistics. What are the actual births reported by the health department in 2010 to 15 and 2015 to 2020 time period? And is my projection run replicating those. Same thing with deaths. Am I actually getting the correct number of deaths? So given the age patterns of fertility and the survival distributions that I calculated, those were recalibrated to generate the actual reported birth and death counts. Please stop me if I'm getting too much into the weeds here. But what that meant was that I ultimately had to make some changes in my starting point for total fertility rate and total crude migration rate before running the projections. And that's what you're seeing here. So that summary table that we saw for migration in the components has been adjusted because I wanted the migrants to then bring me to the 2020 census population. Those adjusted crude migration rates are what you see here. And you're going to see the same thing for fertility. So let's see, the next tab is the fertility patterns. Those come straight out of the components analysis. But when you go to the next tab, the total fertility rates, these are not what were calculated in the components. They've been adjusted in the calibration process to yield the actual reported number of births in the 2010 to 15 and 2020 to time period. What that does is give me a new starting point. I want the starting point in the projections to be as reflective of the actual data, historical data, as possible. And so these rates are somewhat different, but they represent rates that will generate the actual data reported from the Department of Health. And the next one is the sex ratio for each county, taken straight from the components analysis and held constant for each of the counties. And the area names tab is simply a tab that enters the names of each of the projection areas and the projection. So this was our final set of total fertility rates for the projections, the final projections. What I typically do, and this is, kind of before getting to this endpoint, is, and we did through the course of the meetings and working together, run through quite a large number of scenarios. But typically I run through enough scenarios that I get myself thoroughly confused. And so I do a couple of things to kind of track my results. And the first thing that I would do is to kind of record what I've done here, and starting with the first column. And so what I do is copy that column of the column B, and copy that and put it over to the side somewhere.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to be safe here and save this as something else. Not going to call it final for distribution.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. So copy this over.
That and just put it somewhere. Okay. So that the only things that the projection model looks at are these blank areas where the input data is. So it's always only looking at those rows and columns. So I can maintain a lot of intermediate data anywhere else in the spreadsheet and keep it safe. So what I might do is say, okay, well, these fertility rates have been so low for so long. I really think that fertility is going to increase by 2030. And I could increase each of these, say, by 10%. And so I could enter a formula in here that gives me 10%. I could do that calculation outside of the projections program. I could do whatever, or I could say, okay, 10% is about 0.16 and say, okay, 25 to 30 total fertility rate for Belknap is going to be up closer to 1.8%. And I could do that for each of them and say, okay, Cal is going to be 1.7 and Cheshire 1.65. And I could do whatever I wanted to in making these modifications of fertility. But I might say, well, Stratford is Headley College, that's not going to change. Yeah, I can make up any sort of rationale. And what I find important is to keep track of my rationale. And I've done it by doing this same kind of replication within the projection program. I've also done it by setting up a totally independent tracking type spreadsheet where I'll make certain changes, record those changes, and then be able to go in and change those results. So now Ken's changed a whole set of total fertility rates. And before we run this, let's go back to the fertility summary. No, not the patterns, the output one. Yeah, you got to go a few yet.
Go on. There it is.
Okay, and actually you can see here how even in this, I did this in one of them within the output. I did a summary, but I've made some pretty extensive changes here. So I might want to record what the old births were. In fact, let's keep it simple for the training, Ken. Just copy the 2045 to 50. And now let's run the thing. So I think up on the ribbon in the developer tab, oh, you might not have the, doggone it, you might not have the.
Hang on. So that's, I'm in the developer tab.
Okay. Geez, I wish we could figure out how I could get mine running.
I know.
Because let's see, is there, do you need to turn on macros or, click add-ins.
Okay.
Oh, I don't want Office add-ins.
All right. Excel add-ins?
Yeah, try that.
Now those look like.
No. What Let's see, is there anything, let's see, they're not recorded macros. What does macros give you?
Those look like yours.
Is there a calculate projections? Or a run?
I don't see, okay. Whoops. Create migration charts.
No.
Get migration, get MIGR, get output summaries. Hi,
There isn't a run.
I'm not seeing that. Yeah.
How else can I get this? Ah, darn. So device details. Well, shoot.
I don't want to interrupt. Mine's Kathleen Moran. I sort of kind of an Excel expert. Can you just refresh me what you're trying to do? You're trying to get things to automatically update?
No, the projection model, whenever it runs, there's a series of macros that run the Visual Basic Code. And typically, when you go into the developer tab and add-ins, I get an add-in that allows me to go to some of these outputs. And then there's also a run option, which actually initiates the running code.
He might want to go to the Options and Trust Center. But he'd have to see if that's enabled. So if you go to File Options and then the Trust Center, because I do a lot of Visual Basic 2 things, and I don't mean to step on your presentation, but I figured it might be helpful. And then if you just do like trusted documents, and then you can and then or if you go to macro settings and then you enable VBA macros, that might also be there under the Trust Center. But I don't want to delay the presentation for this, but that's just might be a quick fix.
If you want to just try doing that, you're not going to break anything.
So so that's already enabled. Okay, sorry. I'm going blind too. So you might also want to, so then you want to try trusted documents and trusted locations and things like that going up there. All right, so then you got, and then is the location where that file is added there. This is probably getting too much in the weeds, so I'm sorry. Yeah, just making sure that that's where it is. You might have to, the only problem with doing that is you're going to probably have to get out of Excel and then back in, but and then somewhere in there, there's try the message bar, because that also it may not, because I know in mine, I have it so it's set up that it asks if you want to enable the control. So that's another thing. So you can probably now try the message bar if you would mind doing that. And then show, all right, nope, it's not, all right. Go into protected view. I'm sorry, again, sorry, it's been a while and then, all right, enable protect, all right, I guess if you take off the, uncheck those two, the top two, and then hit OK, and then you have to get out of Excel and retry it, that might work as well. The only problem is that you have to reboot Excel to get that to work. But that's my tech support help for the time being. Hopefully it works.
Thank you for the try, even if we don't make it.
Just reopen it, and if it doesn't work, I did my best.
I'm surprised that it hasn't shown that splash screen and the enable and there we go. Okay, close that and you'll get that other documentation screen that you can close when it comes up.
I usually have a message bar that pops up is like to enable, ask about enabling things, but I don't see it here. So that's why it may not happen.
Go ahead, click OK.
I was muted. All right. Are you able to see the screen?
Yep.
Okay.
I am.
Okay. So do you need me to go to developer again, or?
Well, let's try that.
And what's under add-ins, the choice next to developer?
Oh, those at that one. I was looking at the wrong one. I'm sorry.
Thing?
Bob, can you see what I'm doing here? I've got input and output.
Okay, but there isn't, this goes to individual tabs, are there? So what it's not picking up is the macros. Oh, there we go. Run. So,
Okay.
okay. We don't have the changes that you made, but this is what we need to have.
Okay.
Once you go and if you want to go back to that fertility tab, and fertility rates.
Yeah, I've made the changes. They're here.
Okay, so with that, oh, let's double check and see if the output fertility has the old numbers in it.
Okay.
Still there?
Yes.
Yes,
Those are still
okay.
the numbers.
Cool. All right, so click run and calculate projections. It lets you put in a little title or a statement if you want to. I usually, I often start with run 1, run 2, and by the time I'm up to 20, I'm tired of doing it, and you can just click OK.
Okay. Bingo.
And you just saw the numbers all change.
Yeah. Right.
So now, you know, Belknap went from 2,741 to, what is that, 2,956? And statewide, what you've added 6,000.
64,992.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and if you look at the final, the 2045 to 50, the initial was 59,615, and now it's up to 64,976.
Right.
So you can see that, you know, it's pretty easy to go in and make changes in assumptions. The complicated part is before you start doing that, work out some way, some tracking system for yourself, because it's really easy to quickly get confused as to what change you made, which one you want to keep. And in fact, you know, if you had put together another scenario for you. So let's put us out to 2023, 24, and we've got more data from the Department of Health of actual births for 21, 2, 3, and maybe 24. So you've got an actual number, and that actual number is going to vary by county. You can use that actual number kind of as a target so that when you're making, and you're going to make different changes for different counties to be able to come to that target number of births in the total fertility rate. So it's really important if you get into doing that kind of work for your county or region, that you develop some method of tracking, some understanding of what your goal is, if you have a goal. Preferably that goal is based in some real data rather than just I really think it's going to grow by 10% a year sort of thing. Ages ago, in doing county projections in New York State, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the Buffalo area, Western New York. Well, back in the 1970s, you know, when 60s and 70s, when heavy industry just collapsed in many of our northern states, Buffalo was hit unbelievably hard and lost tens of thousands of employment. It was almost impossible to make Erie County, where Buffalo is, grow because of the interaction of the age patterns, because the employment that was lost was basically a lot of prime working age people. if they're families, women are migrating out, and that's your base for generating birth. So you had to specify such unreasonable changes in the patterns and total fertility, total crude migration to try and make the area grow. So in figuring out whether you have a target that you're shooting for, which is most easy to do in vital statistics, births and deaths, because you've got a regular annual way of maintaining that, or monitoring, I should say. And for migration, about all we have are the Census Bureau's estimates to estimate net migration. So if you have some idea of the reality of what's happening, you can better target your changes in these rates. But you really need to keep track of what you're doing and why, so that you don't get confused. So the same thing can be done with the age patterns and the crude migration rate. So we've made a change, pretty significant change in the fertility rates. Why don't we go to the crude migration rate tab? And okay, you've got that copied, and make some changes. You know, some of what we were looking at were pretty significant increases and decreases, and then balanced by some pretty serious speculation that there were things going on that were going to mitigate those changes. So, you know, you want to increase what if, you know, so one of the things that was discussed a fair amount was the effects of climate change. You know, is continued warming in southern states going to result in renewed in-migration to northern states, New Hampshire being one of them, and especially a state with mountainous rural area as being very attractive for future generations. So make some increases there and carry those through, and go back up and hit the run again.
All right, so.
Okay, so let's.
What was the?
Yeah, first go to the population summary.
Yeah.
And between those two changes, we've added 1 million people, 100,000 people to the state. Because before the fertility changes, we're at 1.5 million. Now we're up to 1.6. And what's the? We should have recorded the migration summary total.
Yeah, let's see. Right, so this is the changed.
That's the changed
version.
Yeah, which well, let's see. How much of an additional change in the fertility have we made?
Sorry, I'm still not totally. So
now we're up to 68. Am I reading that correctly? 68?
Yep, 68. Okay.
So we've added about 9,000.
Through fertility.
So before we move off of this, so before we did this migration change, the fertility number, we had gotten up to 66,000. So just making that change in migration has added another 2,000 births. Why? Because that whole pattern has shifted more positively, and that has generated more women of childbearing age, which has generated more births. So you always have to kind of keep in mind that there's always an interactive effect between each of these changes. So the migration change made a difference of about 2,000. The fertility in total has been about 9,000. But now what are we talking? We've got a pretty big migration difference because the total population has gone up by 100,000. So you can make some pretty significant changes in these basic input parameters to test future scenarios. And in our case, you know, we're trying to work off of the historical patterns to come up with a set of projections that'll be used by state agencies for the future. But it gives you an awful lot of what if type of capability. And if all of a sudden in the next couple of years, census estimates show the population growing more quickly or not as fast, you can go back and develop another set of what if scenarios in terms of development. And that's where I'm presuming that most of you are county or regional officials in the planning world, transportation or other worlds. You're going to be able to maintain or be a regular monitor of economic and other types of changes that are occurring. And when you see something that's going to significantly alter some of these patterns, that kind of just goes into the toolkit of saying, of guiding the type of changes in a projection model, such as this, that you'd want to test a scenario for. So I don't know if there's other playing around with changing the assumptions. I think just making these few changes gives you a good look at how it works, that you can use other portions of these spreadsheets that are open to record what's going on. But again, I don't know if there are some questions that have built up. We've still got some time. We can either play with additional scenarios, or I can take your questions and you tell me what you need.
I would say at this point, if you want to just raise your hand or something, if you have a question, that might be the best way to do it.
Hi, this is JB. I've got a question about when this data was broken down into county subdivision. There's something that you used called a housing development factor, I think it was.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I know that I noticed that a lot of for the region that I work in, you know, the positive or the positive change in housing development rate was it correlated with where we saw new housing being built. But also I noticed that there were some places where I think a negative rate was applied, and I was curious if you could go talk about that and what how you came up with those adjustments.
Yeah, the general methodology that was used for doing the MCD projections was a shift share, which basically means you look at the share of population in each MCD, which you see here with the 2000 and 2010 share and the 2020 share. And you can, again, make a variety of assumptions about what that change, what the future change is going to be. So one of the first things that we looked at was, okay, so we're looking at Cheshire County, a town of Alstead. The share declined and declined. Question is it going to continue to decline? And you see that the assumption was that it would continue to decline. And there were a couple of different scenarios of how to come up with an assumption about the future time periods. One was to look at, well, what's the percent change in the share in each time period? And was, you know, is it more appropriate to look at the average across all of the top 3 censuses? Is the first period more reflective of what we expect in the future is the second period. And so there were a number of different ways of approaching how to adjust these shares in the future. And then, as you mentioned, there was a housing component because we had some housing development information in terms of type of housing and number of units, and that was another factor to incorporate. So these negatives in here, I'd have to go back to my notes, which I don't have with me right now, was another adjustment based on taking maybe Ken, if you remember some more detail here, taking the percent changes in shares in connection with the housing development to come up with these future shares. And so it was used as an adjustment mechanism where some of them were simply generating numbers at the end of 2050 that simply for the folks involved on the team just weren't reasonable. And so that negative was simply used as an adjustment mechanism.
So this is Ken. Bob, so for instance, in Cheshire County, we added a larger share to Swansea and to Rindge. And so therefore, is it correct that the negatives will add up to those two positives so that they're offset and you wind up with no net change? Is that correct? And then the question is simply, why did we choose those particular towns? And I think that had to do with the changing share in previous 5-year periods. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Ken, because that's I wasn't thinking of that. The first premise here is that the county totals are fixed. So if you add to the share in some areas due to housing, you've got to take it away from somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. I'm still, can you explain the reasoning behind having a fixed number? Sorry, I'm trying to process that part of it now. Why is it?
The reason behind having a fixed county number?
Yes.
Well, because that's really the detailed level at which we have data to do the component projections. So that was the first challenge because the basic product was county age sex projections. So once that was agreed upon, that became the fixed total where the MCDs had to add up to.
Okay, thank you.
And that's a pretty typical way of generating it. And one of the other kind of general maxims behind population estimates and projections is that its error is much larger the smaller you go in geography. So the assumption here would be that we're able to better project the detail at a county level, state and county level, than we are with a method like this at an MCD level. So again, the smaller areas get fixed or controlled to what we believe to be a more reasonable, accurate number at the county level.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
I just added to the chat that just wanted to report that the most recent population projections that we're discussing now have just been put up on our Still Office of Strategic Initiatives website. So there's a link there in the chat. You can also just go to, you must have our OSI page bookmarked. It's pretty easy to find under the State Data Center as well. Okay. Last chance for questions.
Sorry, Ken, I'm going to just make a comment. This is extremely challenging, and I really appreciate Bob for all the work you've done. And thank you for taking the time to explain all of this. One of the challenges that my regional planning commission is going to have is, interestingly, almost all of the Cheshire County towns, we're predominantly Cheshire County and Hillsborough County. Interestingly, and the towns in Western Hillsborough County are arguably maybe closer to what Cheshire County is than Eastern Hillsborough County, in terms of demographics and population growth and so forth. But what's interesting is that we're going to have a data set that's split, where most of our Hillsborough County towns are growing and most of our Cheshire County towns are decreasing in population by 2050 because of the constraints that we have, to simplify, to try to develop this model. It's going to be a little challenging to explain that to the public, but we'll just have to explain that there are different inputs for and assumptions made in Hillsborough County versus Cheshire County.
Well, a couple of things. Number one, thank you. I appreciate your comments. It's something that I've actually quite enjoyed. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the name of Tom Duffy, but way back in the early 1990s, Tom and I worked on population projections for New Hampshire, and it's been something that I've enjoyed coming back to since then. So I appreciate it, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity. I'm glad that this has been useful also. To your challenge here, though, I think we all have to remember that one of the huge driving forces behind projections within this time period to 2050 that in particular affects a lot of our northern rural states and counties is simply aging. We've got a baby boom population that, as I hate to say it, but it's reality, is dying off in the next 15, 20 years. And it's only to the extent that we are able to attract a younger population that is going to replace it. And so it's a natural constraint on growth when you have that large a population that is going to be removed from the population. So that's part of your explanation, and that was part of the challenge in doing projections, because we know right off the bat that a lot of our areas are faced with decline because of an aging population. And to the extent that you are more attractive or less attractive than other areas around you, you will be able to capitalize on improving or increasing in-migration to compensate. But it's a large number in most all of our areas that we have to compensate for. We've got in New York, something I keep track of, we've got 62 counties in New York, and fully 20 of them are already at a point of natural decline, meaning there are more deaths than births. And these aren't all just rural counties. Broome County, Niagara County, Binghamton, and Niagara Falls. Those are counties in natural decline, and that number will be increasing. And so it's a reality. And so I think that's a big part of your explanation whenever you're faced with that question.
Thank you.
Well, I think we are set then with questions. Bob, I appreciate your going into this great detail with us, especially 2 months after we finished the contract period with you. Do you have any other final comments you want to make for our viewers?
Oh, I don't think so. I guess I've probably talked enough, but I have quite enjoyed the process and have quite enjoyed working with New Hampshire folks in the process. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. And so there's going to be a press release going out there. There may be people calling. Maybe they'll be reaching out to regional planning agencies if we tell them
Okay.
that might be of interest. So, okay.
All
Well,
righty.
once again, thank you everybody for participating in this. I hope it's been informative. I think it was, for me. And we will continue to be in touch as we go along. So thanks again. And I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay.
All right. Thanks,
Have a
everybody.
good one, folks.